Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Roslyn Hill Chapel, a spiritual home for open minds. I'm James Chiriyankandath, chapel elder and your worship assistant for this Unitarian service. Whoever you are and however you are all very welcome into this, our spiritual community in Hampstead. Our children's chapel program, Bright Lights and Creche for children aged 2 and up, is, I believe, open today. Babies under 2 are welcome in the creche, but need to be accompanied by an adult. As you can see, we have laid out seats in rows, but ask you to keep an empty seat between you where possible and appropriate. We request that you continue to use hand sanitizer and to wear masks wherever possible, especially when moving around the building. The service this morning will be led by the elders of the chapel, myself, Ken, Margaret, and Sally. There will also be a half-hour mindfulness session at 6 this evening and music and meditation led by Richard Bobber at 7. You can find more details of all our chapel activities on our website, where you can also download our Open Mind newsletter. If you don't have online access, copies of the newsletter are available from Andrew at the back of the chapel. Do join us after the service for refreshments at the back. And if you're watching at home, you can join tea and conversation in the virtual side aisle via Zoom. Just click the connect link in the YouTube description to find it. We are an independent registered charity, and we rely on your contributions to continue our work. You can donate using the donate button on our website, or donate either in cash at the end of the service in the basket at the back of the chapel, or make a contactless donation by card at the steward's table. And thank you all for the many ways you contribute to our spiritual community. I now light the chalice, symbol of our liberal faith. Love is the doctrine of this chapel. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, in the hope that all souls shall grow into harmony. This is our great covenant, one with another. is now a time for all ages, and Sally will be telling the children a story. So any children here are very welcome to come to the front if you would like to listen to the story.
If you'd like to come over here, children, so that we can see each other. And I hope everybody can hear me clearly, because it is a time for all ages, not just for young people, but for everybody. And what we've brought to talk to you about today is a book. And it's this book. Which I'm sure, if you know about it, you'll recognize it immediately. It's by somebody called Charlie McKeesy, and it's called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. Put your hand up if you know this book already. One or two. That's grand. And Margaret and I. Well, it's an interesting book, because it isn't exactly... It is a story, but some of the time it's not a story. And some of the stories in it remind me very much of other stories that I've read. So it's like the book itself has a history, or like the author has a history, a story of his own life that affects him. And there are two authors that this book reminds me of. One is A. Milne, who wrote, of course, Winnie the Pooh. Have any of you read that one? Yeah. Do you remember the story in it, in Winnie the Pooh, where he takes a present for Eeyore, the donkey? Do you remember what it was? He started out with one thing and he arrived with another, didn't he? It was, in fact, a pot of honey that he took. But something happened to it on the way. As things do happen on the way, hang on. In this book, there's a story about a cake. Because the mole in the story really loves cake. So, what do you think happens to the cake? Say it louder so people can hear. I'll say it for you then. You're right. He's going to eat it. It does. And something else happens in that story, in this book. And another thing about this book is that some of the drawings in it are they remind me of some of the drawings in Winnie the Pooh, but they also remind me of the drawings in my copy of Wind in the Willows. Do you know that book by any chance? It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to you. But the person who's famous for illustrating that book, had a drawing style somewhat like this person's. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you this book to take to Children's Church so that you can look at it. But just so that the grown-ups don't miss out on all of the book this morning. The horses, well, they're all really nice characters you find in this book. But at one point, the boy asks the horse, "What is the bravest thing you've ever said?" asked the boy. I wonder what the bravest thing any of us have ever said is. Can I have some guesses from anybody? It's a one word. Very brave thing. He said, "Help." it's sometimes very brave to admit that we don't know what to do and to ask somebody else for help. So, but there are lots of other really interesting philosophies in this book. So, we're going to sing the children out now, but I'm going to entrust it to you. And when you've looked at it, if you want to, in Children's Church, will you bring it back and either leave it on the lectern or give it to Margaret, because it's Margaret's book. Okay? So thank you for listening, and enjoy Children's Church. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you.
And now Ken will give the first reading.
Building on Roslin Hill by our very own Reverend Kate Dean. Brick by brick and stone by stone, we'll build a chapel of our own. And the neighbours may gawp, the authorities groan. We're building on Roslin, Red Lion Hill. The Honeywoods barn overflowed with Unitarians. They looked for land, but they were banned as dissenter libertarians. Things were pretty awful for members back then, even though they were tolerated by parliamentarians. In 1858, they opened a bank account in their own name. But this plot of land was up for sale in just over a day. A cry from the chapel pulpit for subscriptions rang out. And with a promise of funds, they were able to pay. There were incidents and arguments. Then the idea finally stuck. But each time they raised the funds, the price went up. Finally, through various means, a plan was agreed. Some land for a manse, a generous loan, and a deal was struck. A more beautiful chapel you never did see, filled with artists and thinkers from beam to beam. Walls of Kentish ragstone and a roof of slate. A home for a community who were free to believe. Fast forward to the 60s and a spirit of liberation. Out went the wooden pews, part of an interior renovation. Out the cross on the spire, symbol of Christian heritage. But the cockerel weather vane, regilded in the 1990s, remains. A symbol of wisdom blowing in from all directions.
The first hymn is the Song of Peace. You will find the words inside the order of service. And we ask you to please keep your masks on while singing. Thank you. Our services this month relate to the idea of holding history. So I'll begin by considering what we understand by history. As someone whose professional life has been devoted to studying and teaching history, as well as politics, it has been a personal preoccupation. What does it mean to hold history? The first books that many British history students read at university included The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood and E.H. Carr's What is History? Carr began from the premise that the answer to his question had to reflect our own position in time and form part of our answer to the broader question of what view we take of the society in which we live. In answering the question what history was for, Collingwood's short answer was for human self-knowledge. Both perspectives are relevant to how we as individuals and in community, in this instance, the chapel community, hold our history. To understand what this might mean, let me turn to one of the pioneers of oral history in this country, Paul Thompson. He says that all history ultimately depends on its social purpose. Through history, ordinary people seek to understand upheavals and changes which they experience in their own lives. Family history can give an individual a strong sense of a much longer personal lifespan which will even survive their own death. Through local history, a village or town, or indeed this chapel, seeks meaning for its own changing character, and newcomers can gain a sense of roots in personal historical knowledge. Through the political and social history they are taught and learn, people understand how the political and social system under which they live came about. After over 6 decades of being part of the history of my times, for a decade and a half of which I have been attending this chapel, and over 4 decades of studying, writing, and teaching history, I know that the selective histories we hold, individually, communally, nationally, and globally, play an important role in the actions and imagination that contribute to our present and future. Therefore, it matters how those histories are used and abused, understood and misunderstood, interpreted and misinterpreted, what is remembered and included, and what is forgotten or left out. It is the present nature of our past. We will now play some music for reflection. Before that, I will light a few of these candles to reflect our joys and concerns. If you're thinking of anyone in particular, please feel free to say aloud their name before the music plays.
history of this chapel is held in an amazing book, The Religious Devils of Hampstead. It was published in 1992 and written by a congregational member, Ruth Roundtree, as part of the tercentenary celebrations. If I stand in any spot in the whole of our site, whether this chapel building, the hall, cottages, manse, the gardens or car parks, with the help of the book, I could thread my way backwards to a much earlier time, to the story of beginnings in Hampstead. It's an amazingly researched book, representing thousands of lonely hours of patient dedication, the author sifting through the chapel's records, which had been wisely lodged for safekeeping in Dr. Williams' dissenting library in Gordon Square. Ruth Roundtree presents a pageant of hundreds of our chapel ancestors and tells the stories of crucial situations in our 300-year-old history. That history began at a time of leniency in 1692. Persecution is no stranger to our dissenting past. An act of toleration in 1689 allowed for new dissenting congregations to register to apply for existence. Local landowner Isaac Honeywood did just that in 1692, and his own house was the New Hampstead congregation's meeting place. I will briefly look backwards from 2 points on the site. Firstly, from the chapel, secondly, from the hall. The opening service in this chapel in June 1863 was delivered by a devoted and well-loved minister, Dr. Sadler, whose ministry had lasted for 40 years. The theologian, James Martineau, was also present, and plaques to both exist in the chancel. Earlier today, we heard of the scramble by the congregational members to quickly get together enough money to buy a plot of land before the price went up. Yet again, it was touch and go. But even greater challenges had existed before the middle of the 19th century. We simply were not legal and therefore vulnerable. It had not been possible to use the word Unitarian until 1813, and only 170 years ago, Unitarians did become a legal denomination when the Dissenting Chapels Act in 1844 passed through Parliament. Before that, dissenters' buildings could be confiscated by the mainstream church. That was their legal right. Edwin Field was an energetic member of this Hampstead congregation. He worked for decades to challenge that situation. With the success of the 1844 Act, it is said that Edwin Field ensured a future for British Unitarianism, and only then could this chapel be built with cautious pride. I'm indebted to Ruth for the inspirational story of religious freedom achieved 170 years ago. Perhaps Edwin Field would have approved of the removal of fixed pews in the 1960s, freeing up this large space for a variety of uses, one of them being for use as a recording studio in the later part of the 20th century, also for concerts and for use by another school. To this day, business deals just can't be ignored. Secondly, I look backwards from what is now the chapel hall beyond the garden. The window frames indicate that once it had been a place of worship. In the 18th century, it had been known as a meeting house, and it was the congregation's home until the present chapel was opened in 1863. With safety in mind, the meeting house had been built away from the main thoroughfare in a simple style to deflect attention away from prying eyes and those who simply were in a legal position to grab it if they wanted to. As soon as the present chapel was opened in 1863, a chapel committee formed itself to consider the best use for the newly vacated building. As with other churches in Hampstead, it was decided to use the old meeting house building to offer extensive schooling opportunities. A day school was set up for Hampstead children. The 1870 Education Act was yet to happen. Also, evening classes for young men were set up. Yes, young men. And Ruth notes that Monday evening lectures could attract between 60 and 340 people. I don't know where they stood. After 4 years, these classes in the old meeting house ended, and instead 2 hours each evening for young people could meet, could study, and relax each evening of the week. A day school teacher was paid £100 per annum, and he also had responsibility for the evening classes. All of these activities attracted considerable volunteer work from congregation members like Grace Field and her sisters, who were the daughters of Edwin Field. And these classes existed until 1903. Some 20th century uses of the hall have included housing Belgian refugees in World War I, a cold weather shelter for homeless folk recently, numerous social events, and rented use by 2 schools. So my story is an extremely small part of the chapel's history. And I've been thinking about the word legacy. If one day a library were to exist on this site, we could house not only many copies of Ruth's remarkable book for general use, but we could also offer books published by the Lindsay Press, the Unitarian Publishing House. History is held in books and other devices. And perhaps this library would be, as they say, a fitting tribute to Ruth Roundtree's labor of love. Also, it could honor the achievements of so many of our ancestors in their determination for a dissenting chapel to be available for people like us, their chapel descendants. And it could speak of our concern for our chapel descendants. And perhaps we should hold on to Stephen Hawking's words, never give up.
We'll now sing our second hymn, The Healing of the Nations. Please wait for, John will play through the tune once, and then we'll begin. And now ask Sally to give the third address.
Each year, when the time for this elders' service comes around, the agenda for our meeting, one of about 3 or 4 which we hold each year, is dominated by making plans for it. And this year, as has been said before, I think, Kate asked us to stick with the monthly Unitarian Universalist Association theme of holding on to history. And as we talked at that meeting, the structure of today's service became very clear to Margaret, and that helped the rest of us to bring our individual ideas into shape. It seemed to me that people need no encouragement to hold on to history. We do so in more ways than one, some positive and some not. For instance, too often referring to past actions as a tried and trusted pattern for the future. Our language is littered with mutually understood phrases, such as, he or she does not bear a grudge, or in the light of experience, or knowing what we know about this or that, indicate that we think of ourselves as having learned all sorts of things from history, despite how history sometimes shows us that we do not, and how often we have repeatedly applied the same less than successful responses to events and circumstances. One definition of madness is to go on doing the same thing, expecting a different result. And I must admit that I've been guilty of doing that more than once. Some little time ago, I decided to reform myself and not do it. And when the same old wrangles came up between myself and other people, I thought long and hard and conscientiously and consciously responded with different ideas delivered in a different tone. And it worked to an extent. However, the problems which engendered the wrangles in the first place too often remained, still in want of a solution, and the different responses I had come up with seemed to have had little or no effect. In the light of that bit of my own personal history, I wrote the following poem. We must speak from our hearts, and to hope to be heard by those listening with every fiber for our true intention. When we have examined our memories and our motives, questioned our conclusions, seriously sought out the realities of our situation, we must carefully construct how we say what we say. And having done so, we must listen with minds and eyes wide open to see why what happens, happens. Wearing my elder's hat and thinking of today's service, I began to extrapolate from there a little. How might a small community such as ours use its history to help with its problems and realities? Perhaps as a group, making progress with shared recurrent problems needs a deeper examination of the history, followed by measures formed in the light of a newer, closer look. Or perhaps we should all always be looking for a different way forward in present circumstances. Holding on to history, yes, but making sure that it does not hold on to us, using it to explore rather than to map. After all, why do we appoint a group of elders? One of the main qualifications is that you have knowledge of the chapel's history during your time as an attendee. So what does it do for us, essentially? Well, I think it binds us together. I think it's a large part of why we all come here. Although we may not be very conscious of it, remembering and sharing our experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, gives us value in each other's eyes. Since I've been attending the chapel, and do bear with me here, but I've garnered all sorts of memories. We were married here. My husband's sitting right there. I gave my 60th birthday concert when I came out as a diva to everyone in my life. For me, many of my memories are around singing in the choir and with the chapel choir. And I think I began that in about 1997 or 98, in the days of Susie Digby, Margaret. Yeah. I've put down here the fun and agony of fundraiser concerts with chapel choir members. And then there are stellar performances by amazing guest performers brought into chapel by a succession of musical directors. And Margaret's amazing musical sons, really fabulous. But I also remember bazaars and banners. I helped to make 2 of them. And I remember chapel personalities, from stalwart members of the board through a cantankerous personality of 2 and their soapboxes, many gifted administrators, and of course, some ministers, some much loved, some unloved, and a couple who were possibly mad. Among these memories are others: book sales, poetry, poems written and read, treasured and tragic memories of funerals and memorials of friends. I also remember fondly many experiences of meals shared, cold weather shelters assisted at, cakes and crumbles cooked and drooled over. And at this time of year, of course, I think back to Christmas carol services, and always, most importantly, friendships made. What would your lists contain? Items will coincide and differ from each other, but all the stories, all the histories are our collective heritage.
Give thanks for hope that, like a seed of grain, lying in darkness does its life retain, to rise in glory, growing green again. Thanks to John for the wonderful music as always, and thanks to my fellow elders for their contributions, and to all the volunteers who make our Sundays so special. Please join us for refreshments at the back of the chapel, and a reminder that you can donate in cash using the basket on the steward's table, and you can also now make a contactless contribution by card, again at the steward's table. And please do note, we aren't using the gift aid envelopes at the moment because we've found they have some incorrect information. Thanks to everyone.